Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is The Curse of Frankenstein. Now, The Curse of Frankenstein came out in 1957, and this was produced by British film studio Hammer, who would later become best known for their gothic horror films. Now, this wasn't Hammer's first horror film. Prior to this, they did the Quatermass Experiment, but that wasn't what you would call gothic horror. This really was their first, as I said, gothic horror film. And I think this was also their first color film as well. I could be wrong on that, but I think it was. At the very least, it was their first color horror film. Now, I have The Curse of Frankenstein on this DVD set here where it comes with 3 other Hammer films, including one of the sequels that was made to this. Now, the film was directed by Terence and written by Jimmy Sangster, both of whom would go on to write and direct many other films for Hammer. Now, the movie was very loosely based on the 1818 novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, and the movie was also made as sort of a loose remake to Universal's 1931 adaptation of Frankenstein. And the success of this movie prompted Hammer to do other loose remakes of the Universal films. The year after this, they did The Horror of Dracula, which of course was a loose remake of Universal's Dracula. After that, they did a remake of The Mummy, and in the 60s, they did a film called Curse of the Werewolf with Oliver Reed, which was based on a book that had nothing to do with the Wolfman, but you could tell that Hammer very much made that film to be sort of their version of the Wolfman. And this is also the first film of Hammer's Frankenstein series. In 1958, they did a sequel called The Revenge of Frankenstein, and that was followed by The Evil of Frankenstein in 1964, and that was followed by Frankenstein Created Woman in 1967, and then Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed in 1969, and that was followed by The Horror of Frankenstein in 1970, which was actually sort of a loose remake of this one, and then that was followed by Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell in 1974. Now, I actually already reviewed the Hammer Frankenstein films for Horror Month of 2014, and those weren't bad reviews, but I decided to take down my old reviews and redo them, mainly because this is going to require some explaining, but it should come as a shock to no one who has been watching my videos for a number of years that I have a bit of a speech impediment, and for some reason there were some words that I knew were spelt with an N at the end, and I knew ended with the N sound, but for some reason I would always pronounce it with the M sound. Like, actually, up until a little over a year ago, every time I said the word own, I was pronouncing it as ohm, and this wasn't something I was consciously aware of until it was pointed out to me. And it was sort of that same deal with Frankenstein. Like, every time I pronounced the word Frankenstein, I was saying it as Frankenstein. Again, something I wasn't really consciously aware of, and when I became aware of it, it was deeply embarrassing to be a grown-ass adult who knows how the name is spelled, and yet I'm still saying it with the N sound in a bunch of reviews that I thought were otherwise good reviews. And I was also getting sick and tired of comments like this, so I decided, you know what, I have to redo these reviews. Now, The Curse of Frankenstein is a horror classic, and this is definitely one of the best horror films from the 1950s, and the film is also pretty ahead of its time. Like, it's tame by today's standards, but there is some sexuality in the film, and there is some gore in the film, albeit it's very, very tame by today's standards, but for the time it was actually pretty shocking. Now, the plot of The Curse of of Frankenstein is it begins where a baron named Victor Frankenstein is about to be executed for murder, so he tells a priest what actually happened, and the whole film is told in flashback. And in the movie you find out that from a very young age, Victor became obsessed with the concept of life and death and what creates life. And at a certain point, Victor and his tutor-turned-friend, Paul Kremp, brought a dead dog back to life using electricity. So this prompted Victor to actually try and create life, something that Paul was completely against because he felt that was going too far. And throughout the film you see Frankenstein becoming obsessed with creating life, so much so that it completely destroys his own humanity. And throughout the film he's creating a man-made body by stitching together the remains of different dead bodies, and ultimately he resorts to murder to get a brain to put inside the body of this creature, and then he brings the creature to life using electricity. And of course the creature then starts killing people. Now, the one thing that's interesting about the fact that the whole movie is Victor telling this priest this story is you get this real sense of the unreliable narrator. Like, for all you know, maybe none of this actually happened, and maybe this is all some mad attempt to escape execution. The only issue with that is if you assume that everything you're seeing in this movie is what Frankenstein is telling to the priest, he outright admits to murdering somebody in his narrative. So that is a bit of a flaw in the movie if you want to assume that maybe none of this actually happened and this is all a story that Victor is making up. But I guess that all depends on how you want to interpret this movie, and of course the sequels to this completely contradict that theory that maybe this is all something Victor's making up. In the film, Victor Frankenstein is played by Peter Cushing, and this is definitely one of Cushing's best performances. And Peter Cushing is my personal favorite Dr. Frankenstein. Now, in the novel and in the 1931 film, Frankenstein was not necessarily evil, rather he was misguided and his ambition led to his downfall. However, in this movie, Frankenstein is an evil bastard. Like, he will stop at nothing to create this creature, even if it means hurting or even murdering those around him. Now, it's never quite clear whether Frankenstein was good in the beginning, but his obsession with becoming like God has corrupted him, or if he was always a sociopath. But Peter Cushing's Victor Frankenstein, to me, is one of the top cinematic villains. Like, I would honestly hold him right up there with Malcolm McDowell as Alex in A Clockwork Orange. In the film, Robert Urquhart, I know I butchered his last name, but he plays the character of Paul Kremp, who is very loosely based, and I emphasize loosely, on a character from the book. And he really is, I would say, the protagonist of the movie, because you really do sympathize with him, and you get the idea that he does genuinely love Victor, and, like, you genuinely feel for him when he has to watch this person that he cares about turn into this monster. Now, in the film, Hazel plays Frankenstein's cousin/fiancée, Elizabeth, and before you make any smart-ass comments about that, keep in mind that the movie is taking place in a time when marrying your cousin wasn't as taboo as it's probably rightfully so now. But in the film, it turns out that it's sort of an arranged marriage, and Elizabeth also feels like she owes Frankenstein because it turns out that he helped her and her mother out financially as she was growing up. But honestly, I thought Elizabeth was kind of the weak link in the movie. Now, Hazel did a fine job in the film, but the character herself I didn't really care for. I honestly found Elizabeth to be kind of annoying in this movie. In the film, you see how Victor really doesn't give a crap about Elizabeth, and that's not Elizabeth's fault, of course, but I hated how she acted like she knew Victor and she owed Victor this marriage when they really didn't know each other. At least in the novel, Victor and Elizabeth grew up together, whereas in this movie, Elizabeth's love for Victor really does seem kind of baseless, in my opinion. Valerie Gaunt plays Victor Frankenstein's maid, Justine, who who is very loosely based on a character from the book, and by loosely, I mean, really she only has the same name as the character from the book, but she's really nothing like the Justine from the novel. In the movie, Frankenstein and Justine are lovers, and you could tell that Frankenstein doesn't really give a crap about her the same way that he doesn't really give a crap about Elizabeth, but she really does love him. And in the film, the creature is played by Christopher Lee. Now, Christopher Lee does a great job in the movie, despite not having any dialogue. But the creature in this movie is not so much a character, rather he's more of a cipher to move the plot along, whereas in the Universal film, the creature was very much a character, and in the novel, the creature was very much the antagonist and protagonist. Now, in the novel, the creature started out as misunderstood, but eventually it taught itself how to read and became extremely intelligent and very articulate, and I actually think had they followed the novel, Christopher Lee could have really played that version of the creature very well, because Christopher Lee was a very intelligent and well-spoken man. So, it's a shame that they didn't give Lee any dialogue as the creature. Now, there are these subtle hints in the movie that the creature is starting to become more intelligent, but they're really just subtle hints. The movie doesn't really follow up on that. Now, despite having little or nothing to do with the book, this is one of my favorite adaptations of Frankenstein. It does, however, lack the religious undertones that were so prevalent in the novel. Like, in the novel, you had this whole deal where Frankenstein sort of represented God, and the creature represented Satan. The one theme from the book that this movie definitely remains true to, though, is the ethics of science. Like, in the film, Pohl's reasoning for being against what Frankenstein is doing is, what Frankenstein is doing is really just science for science sake, and it's not really helping anybody, and he feels that science should be there to better mankind, not better the individual. Now, despite being based on source material that was well over 100 years old at this point, this movie came out in the 1950s, which was the beginning of the atomic age, and a lot of the themes in this film about the ethics of science, I think were definitely relevant and prevalent for the time this movie came out. And the movie's just incredibly well made. It's beautifully shot, and James Bernard's music in the film is phenomenal. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to some short reviews that some friends of mine did on this movie.
Okay, well, The Curse of Frankenstein. I mean, obviously, this is, the film that really started the Hammer dynasty. It really kicked off the Silver Age of horror, so you cannot overestimate the impact that this film had on horror at the time, obviously. Now, one of the things I think that many people talk about, of course, is that it was in color, there was more blood in it. That those are the significant sort of differences between, let's say, the Universal Frankenstein films. But one of the things I think that's really important to note about the Hammer Frankenstein films, starting with The Curse of Frankenstein, is the different portrayal of Dr. Frankenstein, right? Because if you go back to Colin Clive in some of the earlier portrayals of Dr. Frankenstein, there's always this hint of like madness. They're on the brink of insanity. They're yelling and screaming. They're raising their fists at God and sort of, in defiance of God, So there's this sort of like very emotional, very irrational aspect to Dr. Frankenstein. Peter Cushing, you get the exact opposite. He's cool, he's detached, he's elegant, he's witty, he's calculating. It's almost like he mixes like this enlightenment figure of logic and reason with the romantic figure of the individuality, ruthlessness, and rebellion. So I always thought that was really interesting. That's one of the things that I think changed dramatically was this portrayal of Dr. Frankenstein. I always also feel that, even though I love the film very much, it's one of my favorite Hammer films, it's not quite there yet. I think they really refined the formula with Horror of Dracula, right? In Horror of Dracula, you have the direction, the acting, the soundtrack, the story, the sets, the special effects, everything came together. So it's almost like Curse of Frankenstein is almost like a sort of like an early run through of what would later become the greatness of Hammer. It's almost there, but not quite came together yet, right? I think that Terence Fisher probably learned a lot in directing Curse of Frankenstein, which then he applied to Horror of Dracula, and to me, Horror of Dracula is the pinnacle. Well, maybe not the pinnacle, but it's one of the greatest horror films of all time. Not just for Hammer, but one of the greatest horror films of all time. So again, Curse of Frankenstein is such an important film. A film that really sort of redefines horror for the 1960s, even into the early 1970s. And Peter Cushing's performance, of course, is magnetic. He really was the film that really made him, somebody to pay attention to. And then, of course, Horror of Dracula made him the horror icon he is still to this day.
Curse of Frankenstein, I think, is a great, remake or reimagining, but it's kind of debatable which one you really call it. But regardless of what it is, it's a great, Frankenstein film. Definitely one of my favorite Frankenstein movies. What I like about it was that they didn't really, copy or shot-for-shot remake what Universal did. I'm glad, they made, its own movie. Love Peter Cushing. He is great as Dr. Frankenstein. Man, I think he's a lot more evil than, what Colin Clive was. I also like the makeup on Christopher Lee, how, compared to Jack Pierce, they made it, its own thing.
Yeah, The Curse of Frankenstein I thoroughly enjoyed. I thought it was a very effective horror film. Not as good as the Universal Frankenstein, but, I still enjoyed it. I loved the opening music, and I thought it was interesting how this movie focuses more on Dr. Frankenstein than the monster, as opposed to the Universal movies, which mostly focused on the monster. And the part I found really funny was when Elizabeth says that it's Victor's greatest wish to marry her, and then immediately after it cuts to him making out with the maid. And I like how his assistant tutor refers to building this creature as a revolt against nature. Peter Cushing does a very good job as the Doctor. He's definitely more refined than Colin Clive's Mad Doctor, but he's also evil, whereas Colin Clive's Doctor was just somewhat crazy, but still, good at heart. This one is just dead set on making his creature and will quite literally kill anyone who gets in the way. Let's see. I like the quick zoom in on the monster's face after he tears off the bandages. I'm not as big a fan of this monster makeup design as I am of the classic, Boris Karloff Universal one, but I think it was still pretty creative what they did. They really made it look pretty messed up. Wow, that is one ugly monster. And, like I said, this version of Dr. Frankenstein is most definitely evil, even if he's not visibly crazy. But I also just like how Frankenstein tells Paul to let the man rest in peace while he can. That was also pretty good. And in conclusion, yeah, it's a pretty good film.
So, I hope you enjoyed my friend's takes on this movie, and that was my review on The Curse of Frankenstein, and my next movie review will be The Revenge of Frankenstein.